Imagine walking out of your life with a single backpack and deciding that whatever you build next will refuse to be owned. If that sounds impossible, stay with me, because this is the story of a man who did exactly that. He walked away from a $300 million company, fled his country, and from exile created a tool that governments could not bend. They tried, they failed, and in failing they rewrote what the internet could be. His name is Pavel Durov, St. Petersburg, early 2014. The city has a winter light that feels both brittle and sharp. On street corners, people gathered, students, activists, strangers, holding up phones and typing into a network that had become the public square, VKontakte, or VK, the Russian social network that Pavel had co-founded. For a decade, VK was less a product than a country. Friendships, politics, jokes, movements. It was the place where Russians spoke, organized, and lived some of their lives. Then the state asked for something simple and terrible. The authorities demanded access to user data, the identities and messages of protesters organizing on VK. They wanted the names, they wanted the trails. They wanted to be able to pick people out of a crowd, one by one. Pavel said no, not in a whisper, not with caveats. He refused in a way that made the choice public. He put privacy before profit, principle before position. And in doing so, he triggered a slow, cold dismantling of everything he had built. Ownership of VK was wrested away. Legal and financial pressure mounted. Friends from business circles drifted away. He was effectively exiled from the company that bore his fingerprints. So one night he left the country with only the clothes on his back and one backpack. No safe house, no corporate jet waiting. Just a passport and a refusal. A small, stubborn truth that he would not betray the people who trusted him. From that precarious margin, Pavel began to build Telegram. Think of Telegram not as just another chat app, but as a philosophy implemented in code. It was designed around two ideas: speed and privacy. Messages that were instant, chats that could vanish, end-to-end encryption. Server architecture that made it hard for any single government to pull a plug, and a posture toward control that was radical. Pavel refused to hand over keys, logs, or backdoors. That refusal turned Telegram into more than a product. It became a lifeline for dissidents in closed societies, a coordination tool in protests, a safe place for journalists and whistleblowers. Millions of people flocked to it because it offered something they had increasingly few reasons to expect online: a private conversation in public. But privacy is a double-edged sword. When you build a space no one can regulate, two things happen at once. The oppressed find shelter, and the dangerous find refuge. Governments began to describe Telegram in stark terms: as a threat to national security, as an enabler of crime. Western intelligence services watched it with suspicion. Authoritarian states watched it with anger. Russia tried to stop it. The Kremlin ordered internet service providers to block access to Telegram within the country. But Telegram was not a centralized target. Its architecture routed around the first generations of blocking. So the government escalated. It blocked IP address ranges, entire cloud providers, and in doing so created a cascade of collateral damage. Online banking services, transit systems, legitimate businesses, collateral casualties in a war against an application. In the process, parts of Russia's own internet faltered. The attempt to extinguish one platform threatened to dim the whole city of connections. In trying to cut a single thread, the state had frayed the fabric. At moments like that, the fight stops being technical and becomes symbolic. Who controls the pipes? Who decides which words travel across borders? The answers have consequences that are not only digital, they are political and deeply human. Pavel's life, meanwhile, was never straightforward. Reports surfaced of detentions, of pressure from foreign law enforcement, of moments when he had to move quietly between countries. At one point, French authorities detained him briefly, an event that made headlines and then as quickly dissolved into the background of diplomatic maneuvering. Interpol, intelligence agencies, the national security services of multiple states. The story accumulated enemies and admirers in equal measure. Some saw in him a libertarian hero. Others saw a reckless provocateur. What explains the stubbornness, the refusal to hand over keys or bow to pressure? There's a personal thread here. Durov grew up in a culture where the state crowds into public and private life. He saw how easy it was to weaponize personal data. He had watched, too, how control over networks translates into control over people. So his choice was visceral as well as tactical. If you value speech, you design systems that make it hard to take that speech away. The technological choices mattered. Telegram's encryption model, its use of distributed data centers, the dual-layer cloud proxies, these were not just clever tricks. They were architectural positions. They implicitly argued some spaces should be governed by the people within them, not by remote ministries. That argument is more explosive than it sounds. It asks a state to concede a field of power. States rarely concede fields of power. And yet, despite the pressure, despite arrests of collaborators and the levies of fines, Telegram survived. Not because it was perfect, but because its users needed it and because its design made it resilient. When a government climbed into the network to smash it, the network flexed and continued. That dynamic, the dance between control and escape, is central to our modern political life. There are costs. Telegram's reputation as a sanctuary for privacy also meant that some bad actors used it. Criminals, extremists, and organized groups seeking secrecy. That reality forces an ethical question that has no easy answer. How do you build tools that preserve liberty while preventing abuse? Pavel's answer was almost doctrinal. Code, not humans, should set the bounds. He resisted building backdoors. Critics argue that refusing any backdoor is naive. Supporters argue that backdoors are invitations to tyranny. Beyond the politics and the cryptography, there is a human strain to all of this. In Exile, Pavel traded immediacy for principle. He traded a home for a project. He became, in many accounts, a mythic figure who moved between names and countries, sometimes celebrated, sometimes chased. He invested in ideas more than in bank accounts. He framed Telegram as a public good for the digitally vulnerable. But myths have jagged edges.
A relentless wave
when we
of digital
celebrate
attacks,
the defiance of one man,
chronicled across
we should not
every
forget
agency
that his
firewall.
choices ripple outward. Telegram's architecture forced states to make painful decisions. Either tolerate unmoderated spaces or take heavy technical measures that damage their own economies. Those are not theoretical dilemmas. They are practical policy choices that affect real people's ability to pay their bills, to receive medicine, to call an ambulance. Today, the story of Pavel Durov sits at a crossroads. We live in a moment where the architecture of speech matters, where the design of a protocol can influence elections, uprisings, and the private tragedies of ordinary citizens, where a single app can be a lifeboat for the oppressed, and a hiding place for those who would do harm. Pavel's life invites a question that refuses a comfortable answer. What would you give up to protect someone's right to speak without fear? Would you hand over the keys if it meant stopping a crime? Or would you refuse, knowing that you might be protecting both the dissenters and the dangerous? There are no easy choices here. There are only trade-offs, and each trade carries moral weight. If this story has a final image, let it be not a shadowy silhouette fleeing across borders, but a quiet moment of a message being typed in a city where speaking could cost you everything. A user sends the message. It flows across wires. Someone reads it in safety. That small act, an exchange of words between two people, is what this fight is ultimately about. Pavel Durov walked away from a company and built a refuge. He made enemies and he made allies. He forced governments to reimagine their power over networks. He forced us to ask uncomfortable questions about privacy, security, and the shape of modern liberty. History will judge him in fragments: hero, fool, visionary, troublemaker. Perhaps the truest measure will be simpler and quieter. Whether, in the end, more people could speak without fear than before. One backpack, one app, one stubborn refusal to hand over the keys. And, for millions, a place to say what needs saying.